so then people
Okay.
will be able to hop on.
Great.
And I'll welcome everybody in a minute or so.
Cool. Yeah, one of the benefits of doing this as long as I have is you learn to be good at a lot of different things.
You have to juggle.
Yeah.
Got people joining, Emily?
Yes, we
Yep.
have 12 on right now.
Okay, I'll start in just a minute.
So I'll make sure I can.
It works.
Yeah.
I'll just say next for each slide. How's that?
Sounds good.
Okay.
Send us asking.
Should be an email from Zoom.
Send to Zoom.
Okay, I think we're ready to get started. I'm guessing we'll have people join us along the way, but we know time is limited and several of you are probably taking your lunch hour for this, so we want to keep things moving along. So first of all, I want to welcome all our Downtown Development Authority members for joining us today for our training. I'm Kathy Brubaker-Clark with the Greater Muskegon Economic Development, or GMED. And along with our partners, the Lakeshore Chamber of Commerce and the Community Foundation for Muskegon County, we're providing this training webinar for you. We feel it's much easier to do this as a webinar virtually than trying to ask all of our DDA members to go somewhere else, such as Lansing, for training. So we're glad you can be here today. Our trainer today for our DDA session is Carmen Avantini. And Carmen is the president of CIB Planning, a community planning consulting firm located in Fenton, Michigan. He has over 38 years of planning experience and specializes in downtown development, economic development, zoning, and site development or redevelopment. I'd also like to introduce Emily Morgenstern from the Chamber of Commerce and Contessa Hood from GMED, who will be hosting our webinar today. Thank you. And they will also be looking at questions. Feel free to put your questions in the question and answer box or the chat box, and they will be monitoring those and asking those at a later time during the session for Carmen to answer those. And with that, oh, one more thing, just so you know, this session is being recorded and we will have it on our GMED website in the future. And Carmen can make his slides available too to those that are joining us today. So please encourage your other DDA members who were not able to attend the session today to go on in a few days to our GMED website and they can watch the session themselves. So with that, I will turn it over to our trainer today, Carmen.
Thank you, Kathy. Greetings, everyone. I can't see all of you right now, but I'm sure you're there. And welcome to our discussion about tax increment financing. It's, in my mind, one of the most misunderstood tools that we have available to us, both through DDAs and corridor improvement authorities primarily. And I think you're going to find that some of the things I talk about maybe are a little bit different than you've heard in the past. So, and hopefully that will be the case. Next slide, please. So let me give a brief introduction on tax increment financing itself. It really, where it comes from in terms of the state act is it's through the, and I'm talking about DDAs and even corridor improvement authorities, but it's all been consolidated under Act PA 57 of 2018. And what it does is it allows these taxing authorities to capture local property tax increment to pay for eligible expenses that you've identified in your plan. Next slide, please. Now, within a DDA plan, and once again, this will apply to corridor improvement authority plans also, there's really two parts. Even though we do them as one plan, it's got two separate sections. We have a development plan and we have a tax increment finance plan. And if you look at the state act, you'll see that each is dealt with separately also. Next, please. So within the development plan, here's some of the things that we're going to do. We identify what the DDA boundaries are. Okay, this is how, where we want these boundaries to be established. And you might think that's an easy thing to do, but in some communities that can be very challenging. You want to make sure that you're doing boundaries that will cover not only areas where you're going to be able to capture tax increment, but also where you can make improvements and you need to make improvements within that district, because that's where the money has to go. The tax increment money has to go within the boundaries. There are a few minor exceptions, but for the most part, that's how it works. In the development plan, we also have to establish our need for the improvement. The state act has some very specific requirements that are in there. I tend to, with many of them, you don't know at this point in time what your needs will be. So it's hard to answer them in with complete answers, complete information. So I'll tell you how I like to handle that with regard to developing these plans. Another thing is you need to engage the public and stakeholders when you're first establishing the district and establishing the plan, because you want people to know exactly what you're doing here and what the plan is for. The one thing that the biggest misconception with a DDA and a plan like this is that people's property taxes are going to go up, when in fact that's not the case. It's just a redistribution of where that tax increment and the taxes are going. And then last but not least, in the development plan, we want to develop a vision. What is it that we're trying to do with this money? What do we want to do within the district? What are we trying to become? And why are these improvements needed? Next slide, please. So here's an example of a boundary for the city of Farmington. This is, it incorporates primarily their central business district. You've probably seen some districts or have districts that go out and include a lot of other areas, but in this particular community, they just decided to include their traditional downtown within that area. Next, please. So one of the things we do in the development plan, one of the more critical things that we do is we want to identify improvements in the district that will catalyze redevelopment. So what are the things that we can do that will make the redevelopment happen? Because that's our whole goal here, is to get projects built and to make things happen. So what we want to do is we want to develop a project list that'll guide the investment of this tax increment financing. Now, what you're seeing right here, this is kind of what I refer to as an old-fashioned list. It's where communities used to put in there all the different projects they want to do, and they put in cost estimates. Well, within a few months of adopting the plan, those cost estimates may not even be accurate any longer. And the one thing you want to be careful of with your project list is to make sure that the categories are general and they're all inclusive. Because if you should happen to come up with a project that doesn't fit within the categories and the descriptions you've created, you have to amend your plan. And I don't know how many of you have amended a DDA plan before, but in my opinion, it's more difficult to amend a DDA plan just in terms of the legal requirements than it is to adopt a master plan or a zoning ordinance. It's very challenging. So my goal when I write DDA plans for communities is to help make sure that the project list is expansive and broad enough that it will cover most any project that you will have moving forward in the future. Next slide, please. Now, the TIF plan, on the other hand, in the TIF plan, you want to explain the purpose and meaning of tax increment financing. So why are we collecting tax increment and what does it do? What does it mean? So we're going to include a description on that. We also include tables that explain the tax capture, and here I had for Farmington, but can be for any community. So what are the tax capture? What are the tables telling you about your base year and your taxable value moving forward? So these tables show how taxable value will increase over time. So you're going to put a time frame in there, and you're also going to show how the taxable value will increase. Now, once you do that, the subsequent tables, in particular, table 3, will show how the tax increment will grow, where you're getting that money from, which taxing jurisdictions, and how it will grow over time. So at the end of the table, you'll have a number that says over this 25 or 30-year period, here's how much money we anticipate collecting. Next slide, please. So tying these together, the TIF plan. So the TIF plan shows us how the captured tax increment will be used, and it ties back into the project list and the associated tools. So what I like to do in DDA plans is when we have that list of projects, what I do is I come up with broad, for the duration of the plan, come up with broad dollar amounts that tie back into the total amount that's going to be captured over that period of time. So if you've got a 30-year DDA plan, TIF plan, and you're going to capture $20 million, I like to show the breakout of the different project categories. I like to put numbers that add up to that number, to that 40 million or whatever that number ends up being. So on that third table, what it also does is it shows you where the tax increment's coming from, which taxing jurisdictions will be captured. Typically, you cannot capture school taxes, like primary and secondary education. You can collect certain like community colleges and other taxing jurisdictions like that, but not the primary and secondary schools. It might also include, ambulance service and others. Unless they're willingly staying in, you can't capture libraries either. That's part of the new act, that it allows libraries to opt out of it, stay out of it. But also really the biggest capture for a DDA plan comes from the county and the local community. Those are the two big ones, with the county being the biggest. So the purpose, also in the DDA plan, we're going to list out what the term is. We're going to say it's going to be 20 years, it's going to be 25 years, it's going to be 30 years, whatever. And the thought is when that term ends, then the TIF plan ends and you're no longer capturing taxes, and the taxing jurisdictions all get their normal taxing capture from that district, but it's based on much higher numbers. And typically, though, what will happen is a DDA will negotiate with the county and the other taxing jurisdictions before that term runs out. So that's something that will typically happen. Sometimes you still need all of the capture. You might find after the 30 years or whatever that number is that you don't need all of it. So you work out a sharing arrangement with the taxing jurisdictions. But you got to have the term in there, and it has to be reflected in the tables also. And another thing we have to do is at the end of the plan, usually in the appendix, we have to list out all of the properties, the tax ID numbers for each of the properties that are included in the TIF district. It's a legal requirement. Next slide, please. So here's how tax capture works. Okay, so if you look at 0, that's our base year. Okay, that's, let's say our capture is worth, we have a base value of $10 million. Okay, so any new taxable value that goes above that $10 million, in this case for 20 years, will make up the taxable value that we can capture. So when it goes from 10 million to 15 million, we're able to capture the tax increment for $5 million. The original 10 million continues to be taxed by the taxing jurisdictions at that same rate, or whatever the millages are for that particular base value. Okay, so we're only capturing the new tax increment, the new taxable value from years 0 through 20. So at the end of it, it might be, the base value might be a total of, even though we started out at 10, it might be 40. Okay, and so after the 20 years, as you can see here, all of the revenue, the tax increment revenue, goes back to and directly to the taxing jurisdictions. So that's how conceptually it's supposed to work. Once again, many taxing jurisdictions still need to have the plan in place, and will usually negotiate something with the county and the other taxing jurisdictions. Next slide, please. So here's some basic facts about TIF capture. So it does capture both real and, of course, personal property tax is no longer a real big thing It does still capture it, but it's no longer. There were changes made to the tax law when Governor Snyder was in that minimized the impact on personal property taxes. Once again, can't capture school debt millages, but you can capture debt millages from all the others except for the library. Now, the expenditures must be spent within the district boundary, except for some infrastructure, like if you have a road that needs to be replaced or sewer and water lines to service the district, you might be able to use that and have it qualify. But for the most part, it has to be spent within the district. Another thing too is a maximum of 80% of annual revenues from the TIF district can be pledged to repay bonds. Next slide, please. Here's a sample of the table 3 that I was talking about, and it's kind of small, but you can see that in the end it adds up to about $32 million in capture. And so basically the DDA is capturing the increasing taxes that result from these rising property values. What we usually do in these tables is we use a 2% per year estimate. You don't have to be exact. It's an estimate, it's a guide. And at 2% per year, it could be 3%, it could be 5%. It depends on the district and how well it's doing. You can end up capturing more than that, but we're using 2% as a safe number right now. It's based on cost of living over the past 20 or 25 years. That could end up changing in the future, but you don't have to go back and change your table as a result. The existing taxes will continue to go to the taxing jurisdictions, but any of the increases go to the DDA. Now, as I just mentioned, the capture will increase faster when redevelopment occurs. You're going to get more based on the number of projects that you have going. Now, you can bond for improvements using this income from the TIF, anticipated income. It has to be approved by the elected body, though. It's not something that can just be approved by like a DDA board or a corridor improvement authority board. Next, please. Now, here's something that I came up with a little while ago and seems to be working really well for us. It's called project-specific tax capture, and we're using it as a tool. Most of the DDA plans that you work with are district-wide, and they typically use the funding for public improvements like streetscape or sewer and water improvements or things like that. The nice thing about project-specific capture is it can relate to a specific building or development. And what it allows you to do is you can calculate, if that project is built, you can calculate how much tax tax increment will be captured as a result of that project. And you have the ability to rebate that money back to them for a specified period of time in an effort to close the gap. Many projects, especially redevelopment projects these days, have a gap. It could be $200,000, could be $1 million. It might be due to the cost of materials having gone up. It could be the cost of cleaning up environmental contamination. There's a number of things that can cause redevelopment to be more expensive than like greenfield development. So there ends up being a gap. If you don't help them find a way to close the gap, then you're not going to get the project anyway. So what you're just doing is from that project, you're agreeing to forego new taxes and tax increment for a specified period of time. It could be 5 years, it could be 10 years. It's whatever is needed for the community to work out the deal with the developer of that project. Now, here's a thing that I learned a lesson on. One of the communities I worked in many years ago, we had a major project recreating a downtown. We had developers in hand. We worked on an agreement where the developer would do the buildings and that end of it, and the city would pay for the public improvements utilizing tax increment that was going to be captured from all the private development that was going to occur. So, but we needed the infrastructure in beforehand. So the city borrowed the money using a bond, created all the roads and public improvements and park areas, even like a gazebo type thing that's used for bands. And as part of it was constructed, the recession hit and the developer lost the project and everything went south on property values, the DDA and the city were no longer capturing tax increment, and it went into the negative. So the city had to borrow the money to pay back the bonds for several years. The DDA is in the process of paying it back because once the economy picked up and development occurred, now all of the residential development is just about completed, and there's a lot of it. Still haven't finished all the mixed use development, but the residential development was finished. So the idea I had is, and the lesson I learned is, why should the city borrow the money? Let's have the developer borrow the money, and through a development agreement, we as a community, as a DDA, will agree to rebate this money back each year after your taxes are paid. Okay, so there is no risk at all for the community in this type of a setup. So you don't give them the money back in the rebate until they pay the taxes. If for some reason the development goes under, you're not at risk as a community for the public improvements or any other improvements that were necessary. But yet your commitment to, through a development agreement, to be able to rebate this money back to them can be included in their pro forma when they're going to borrow money, because it's considered a financing source. It can be stacked with brownfield developments. Okay. I work with a consultant that is really good at knowing how to stack them in such a way that you get maximum advantage out of it for the developer and the community. But it makes a lot of sense to do it this way because there's absolutely no risk for the community. And when you have residents that say, well, you're giving up, our tax money. Well, really, no, we're not, because if we don't get this project, there's no tax increment or tax money coming in, then you're basically just giving them back for a certain period of time the taxes that they're paying in order to make the project happen. Okay, so it becomes a win-win for the community and the developer. Next slide. Now, the thing about setting up project-specific tax increment financing like this is it's not specific to a project. It can be any project in the district area. It's available to all applicants and all property owners. Anybody can apply to do something like this and enter into this type of agreement. So what you need to have if you're going to do something like this is you have to have an application and review procedures. Okay, some projects will be higher priority for you than others. Okay, and some you may only want to go a maximum of 5 years. Others you may be willing to go longer because it's a priority project. So you're going to need to have review criteria by which you judge applications that come in, and you want to make sure that you're not being accused of playing favorites. Okay, so we need to have that evaluation criteria in place and decide with each project how long and how much you're going to rebate back to them. So this all happens is culminated in a development agreement that you have your attorney obviously draft and work on, but you enter into this agreement with each applicant. And that way you can not only put in how much money, but any conditions that you have in there to make sure that the project is built the way they said they would do it. Okay, next, please. Now I'm going to give you an example of where DDA funds that I've been familiar with, where DDA funds have been used to help with incentivizing projects and helping with redevelopment. Here's a community I've worked in for 27 years, the city of Fenton. Originally, it was a one-story one-story building, urban renewal mall, downtown. They tore down many of the old buildings and closed off the main street and had a loop road around the city, around the downtown. And it was, when I started there, it was pretty much dead, the downtown. So what we did is working with the DDA, we acquired properties, private properties in that urban renewal mall area and did demolition. Actually helped the fire department out quite a bit because they use that for practice. And obtained other state money to open up North Leroy Street, which you're seeing right here. This is a street. So recreating the street that originally went through the downtown and closed up, didn't close off the bypass road, basically turned the bypass road into part of a parking lot. So it's now just an entrance to a parking lot and a parking lot. So we got rid of the bypass road. We opened up the street. And actually this cross street Caroline to the right of this picture, that was also closed off. And about 2 years ago, we opened that piece of the street back up again. So we recreated and reestablished the grid network for downtown. And since that time, this was the first multi-story building we put in. It's retail first floor and residential condos in the top 3 floors. We are now completing our 3rd multi-story building. And with each of these buildings, there has been DDA financing assistance, either with property acquisition or closing the gap with each of the buildings. And there's also been some MEDC participation. One of them is a brownfield site. So we're just finishing the 3rd multi-story building, and we're likely to see a couple more within the next 2 to 3 years. So totally changing the complexion of downtown. It's become a foodie place. The building that's just behind us, where this building is shown, currently it's not quite finished, and almost all of the retail on the 1st floor is leased out, including a new restaurant. 2nd floor is offices, and they've already started leasing that. And 2 floors of apartments that have almost all been leased up already, and they're not finished. So this is all during the pandemic that this has all happened. So it just goes to show you, working with TIF financing, how you can help incentivize projects. And the ultimate goal is eventually we won't need to use TIF financing for that. We can use it for other things. But for now, it's been helpful in getting these projects going until the real estate market can jump in and take over. When we started this project, I think rents for retail space were around $10 a square foot. The newer buildings are getting more between $25 and $30 a square foot for retail space. So that kind of shows you how the market has changed. Next slide, please. Here's a project that we've been working on for a while. They're actually in the process of doing demolition and environmental cleanup. This is in Meridian Township. It's called the Village of Okemos, and it's going to be a mixed-use, multi-story mixed-use downtown, where their current downtown existed. Historically, the downtown was located in this area. It had become kind of like suburban looking. And the real challenge was that there were uses in there, like a couple of gas stations and a dry cleaning operation that historically had contaminated the ground area. And there's so much contamination that it's actually leaching outward. And you cannot, in this area, you cannot just like redevelop a property. You had to redevelop the whole thing as one in order to clean up the environmental contamination. The cleanup is over $10 million for just the environmental cleanup. And it could not be funded entirely through the brownfield. So we worked out a project-specific tax increment financing plan, working with the DDA and with the township, that will allow those funds to be used for environmental cleanup, but also public and private infrastructure throughout the project. So developing a win-win situation. The one point that we made, we had to go to each of the taxing jurisdictions and sell them on this because they did not currently have a plan in place, the township, that allowed them to capture what we needed to have captured. So we went to each of the taxing jurisdictions with our game plan, and it was very well received by all but the library, which we kind of expected. But like CATA, which is their transportation authority, they were the first ones to look at our proposal. And the director there, Brad, said, who is formerly a planner, he said, "This is the best tax increment financing plan I've ever seen. This is like the gold standard. Not only will we support it as an organization, but I personally will go with you to the other taxing jurisdictions and help get their buy-in." So, I mean, that's the kind of response we got. And it was very difficult. We had to enter into agreements with each of the taxing jurisdictions, so they knew exactly where the tax capture was going. But we were successful, and there have been other challenges along the way, but the project is still moving forward. And I think that's the key part. They use the tool to get the project built, because without that tool, it wouldn't have happened. Next slide, please. Here's a project we've been working on behalf of the city of Farmington. And this is just a rendering of one of the possibilities that we had looked at. We actually, what we did in this case is we use project-specific tax increment financing. We updated their DDA plan, included project-specific tax increment financing. We're currently working on their applications and review process. But what we did is we put into an RFQ for developers that we had not only this, but also brownfield funding available because it's a former contaminated school building site. And the city wants urban housing here because it's right behind their downtown buildings. So we put together an RFQ and made it very developer friendly because the consultant on our team who does brownfields works primarily for developers. So we were able to set it up the way developers would want it set up. We actually had 4 proposals submitted for this development. The council worked it with us and got it down to a final one. And we are now working on a development agreement for this site to redevelop it. So what we did is we used the tax increment financing as a tool and help the community be developer friendly, so to speak, to encourage new developers, went out and solicited and then chose the best one. If the first developer that was selected doesn't work out, we can move to the second one. But we had great responses on this. So another example of where TIF, project-specific TIF financing can be used as a way to encourage new development. And I think that was the last example. If you want to go to the last slide. So in closing, one thing I want to say is DDA plans and TIF financing. In the plan itself, our opinion is that you should make the categories as broad as you possibly can, only answer the questions as far as they can be answered in terms of the legal requirements. If you want to put a lot of the other information like projects and detailed cost estimates and things like that, we recommend that you put them in a separate document and refer to it as like a strategic plan or implementation strategy or something like that, but keep it in a separate document because you're going to want to update that regularly, annually, if not sooner, as you accomplish things. And it's a lot easier to update something if it's like a policy manual, policy guide, than putting it into your plan itself and having to amend that all the time. So, our recommendation with TIF plans and DDA plans is just do what the ordinance requires. Don't give them more than they're absolutely asking for. If you want to put that into a document, put it into a separate document and use it as your policy guide. So there's a lot of information I've thrown at you. Once again, I can't see any of the participants. If you want to go to a full tile with all the participants and give them an opportunity to ask questions. I think we've got 2 in the Q&A here. Do you want to ask me those questions then?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, we're not able to give people access to video and audio since we're in webinar mode, but you guys can put all of your questions in the Q&A and we can read them off.
Okay, that's good. If you want to start sending them my way, that would work.
Yep, so the first question is, what happens to the graph model if during the term of the millage rate goes down?
Yeah, that's what we call being underwater. Okay. If you end up going underwater, which happened to a number of DDAs during the recession, what you do is you redo your plan and you reset your base. Because as long as your base value is higher than your assessed values for properties, you're not going to be making money. You're going to be owing money. So as soon as you think you've hit rock bottom or thereabouts, redo your plan, reset your base. If you need to readjust your boundaries accordingly, you can do that. But then anything in the future that you're getting, you'll be getting a positive. I worked with communities that had been 6, 8, 10 years into the negative. And I'm like, folks, you need to update your plan and reset your base. Because what happens during a recession like that is, property values could drop 30, 50, 100%, whatever that number is, but you can only increase them 3% per year because of the Headley Amendment. So you need to get that base value set back to where it is currently as soon as you possibly can so that you can start capturing new tax increment. And we did that with a number of communities. Good question.
Thank you. Okay, we have another question. In the scenario you gave for the developer borrowing the money, would that mean the city would not seek the bonds at all?
Yes, correct. It keeps it keeps you from doing what we did in that community and from owing money when you potentially don't have tax increment to bring it in. Now, if it's a project that isn't project specific like that, if it's like streetscape or district wide, streets or something, infrastructure, yeah, then you may want to borrow and bond to be able to accomplish those things, because they benefit the whole district. They don't benefit a property. But if you're doing a specific project or an area with, even if it's a bigger area like the one that we had seen on the plan there for Meridian Township, let the developer borrow it. Why take on the risk if you don't have to?
Awesome. All right, if you need to secure funds from the state, does someone need to write a grant?
Typically with MEDC, they do have an application process, and it's usually for the developer. There will be things on there that the community has to answer and help support, but the developer is the one who actually applies for the money. And they do have a review process. It takes a little bit of time, but it can be done. We recommend to folks that are applying for this money, sometimes the Regional Economic Development Agency can help them with it. Sometimes they hire a consultant to help them with it. It all just depends, but it usually is the developer that fills out the application and requests it from MEDC, because the money is going directly to them, not to the community. It's a good question.
All right, so that looks like that's all the questions we have right now in the queue. We will send out your email if anyone wants to have any follow-up questions after this. And as well, this will also be recorded, so we'll send you this recording too.
Okay, great. Just in closing, thank you for all of you who've been involved. It isn't a terribly lengthy presentation, but there's only so much you can say about a DDA, in plan and TIF financing, because it's all prescribed by the state. Where it really becomes creative is when you do things like this project-specific tax increment financing. And eventually, I'd like to do a session on the application, establishing the application, setting up the review criteria. We've done that. We did that for Meridian Township. We received a MEDC redevelopment ready communities grant to help them pay for that effort. But it was far more detailed and complicated than most communities are going to want to deal with. That was what they wanted. So we're in the process of, and I hate to use the term dumbing it down, but we're in the process, as we do work with Farmington, of coming up with a much simpler set of criteria and review process to do that. So when we get through that process, we will definitely be in a position to hold a different seminar dealing with just that, and helping communities move forward with that type of a tool, because there aren't that many tools left for communities to incentivize development. And that's one of the great ones that we have available, and it's entirely controlled at the local level, which is a nice thing.
Well, I want to thank you, Carmen. We've enjoyed our DDA session today, and certainly let me know too once you get your new session figured out, because I'm sure we do have some communities who use DDAs a lot and others that are just starting to get into it. And I think that could be very helpful for them once you have that in place. So again, thank you. And as we've said, there'll be a recording of this session on our website. So please encourage your fellow DDA members to go and take a listen. Again, thank you to Emily and Contessa for your help today and facilitating this webinar. And with that, I will say goodbye to everybody, and thanks again.
Thank you, Kathy.